All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It's Tuesday, April 12th of 2022. We've got playoff basketball, or I guess play-in tournament basketball. We've got an early slate of baseball. We've got a main slate of baseball. Lots to talk about here today. I just want to get started, jump in right away. We've got questions on baseball, on basketball, so we'll get into everything here as we go along. Real quick, I wanted to pull this up before we got started. You guys asked for it, and it is now out. 4 simple rules to build your MLB DFS bankroll. I'm sure you can guess where that's going. Bankroll management, contest selection, cheat sheet, and guide for the baseball season. It's actually pretty cool. I definitely recommend checking this video out, even if you've watched some of the others and are familiar with the concept. The concepts that we talk about for contest selection. I made a spreadsheet and put it up into a Google Drive or on Google Sheets or whatever. That I think it's a pretty cool little tool to you can, kind of say, this is my bankroll. These are the contests that are out there in the lobby, and it'll kind of help you figure out what contests are best to play, at least to help build a sense of intuition about what the best contests are out there. For baseball in particular on DraftKings, I know I've heard a few of you mention it, and I totally agree. It's been a little bit harder to know what the best contests are to play, even if you're familiar with what in general is our general philosophy about contest selection, maximizing EV while spreading out your variance as much as possible. Mostly because there's not the $1.20 max is not as big as it is for NBA. There's 2 mini maxes, which aren't really the best contests out there. Anyway, definitely recommend going and watching that video and playing around with that spreadsheet. Because I think it's pretty cool. I'm pretty proud of it. I've been using it a little bit myself, messing around with it. I think it's pretty fun. So anyway, as always, if there's questions about it, if you watch it, I know there were already a couple questions. People left questions as comments to that video. I responded to those earlier today. But as always, if you've got questions, happy to talk about that more in detail on this show. But let's get into it here. Let's start answering some questions. We'll get the app pulled up. We'll start on the NBA side of things. And get into this here. So there's kind of a few questions all about NBA. We'll kind of group these together, talk about it a little bit. This first one was from Jesse, and he said, "Do the Sims account for the condensed player rotations during the NBA playoffs?" Let me go ahead and read. Let me actually just read all 3 of these questions here, and we'll kind of talk about NBA playoff strategy just in a very broad way here. So this next one was from Rogue3 here. He said, what are the major differences when playing NBA playoff slates in terms of strategy and player rotations and minutes, etc.? Do you have any tips or rules of thumb for a newer player? And then Nikhil actually, just a couple minutes ago, popped this question in here. So we'll read this one as well. And he said, I've never played NBA playoff DFS before. Do lineups still come out a few minutes before game time like the regular season? Should I bother playing tomorrow's main slate if I won't be around a league spot for the late game? So good question. So let's talk about, I guess just in basketball terms to get this started here. So a couple things that are different about playoff basketball. Rotations are going to condense a little bit. A lot of times, even if a coach has been using like 10 more, 9, 10, 11 guys in their rotation throughout the regular season, a lot of times that condenses as the playoffs go on. And it kind of continues to condense as the playoff goes on a little bit too. You will see like even teams get down there in the play-ins games like today. I don't know if we're going to see super condensed rotations because, these teams want to win the game, but if they win the game, they still got to make it through the rest of the playoffs. But as things move along, you'll see teams really get condensed rotations down there. I think in some of the finals games, you'll even see sometimes 6 or 7 man rotations, sometimes in some of these late playoff games where teams really are just kind of putting it all out there. You'll also see more strategic matchup decisions coming into play. And those, we'll talk about that here in a bit. I think that's part of where it gets kind of really interesting. I guess specifically, we're kind of more answering this question. But I think one of the things that gets really interesting about playoff NBA DFS is that you're working with kind of a data set that's pretty small, and coaches will shift things up to match up strategically and change things pretty quickly. And predicting or understanding whether something is an outlier game or a unique component of that particular game, or knowing what the coach is going to do for the future games kind of gets kind of interesting strategically, right? I think one interesting example that I was just diving into here this morning, just messing around with this, starting to see how things are looking. First of all, before I go much further, I am referencing the projections and the minutes and things like that as they are right now. It's the middle of the day. There will probably be a lot of dialing in as the day goes along. And in fact, what I'm seeing here actually has already changed since I was preparing for this stream just a minute before. But one of the things I was looking at before is that the Clippers need to come figure out some way to match up with Karl Anthony Towns today, right? And I actually I noticed really in particular, at least before. Actually, this has now been remedied. So I'll show you what I was looking at 15 minutes ago. 15 minutes ago, Hartenstein had like a very small minutes projection. It looked like we didn't even really expect him to play. And Zubac's projection was also a lot lower. It was like 20 minutes. This now actually does add up to about 37 minutes or so, which makes a lot more sense to me. I'm basically imagining that, the Clippers are going to have to match up with Towns. And they're going to have a big out there to defend Towns. And those kinds of things, I don't really typically get into playoff matchups or matchups on a regular season basis as much in the NBA for a couple reasons. One, there's a lot of games, and I don't really think you need to, right? With the late swap news you typically get enough of an edge just playing the best value plays without worrying how individual teams are going to match up. In NBA, there's a bigger, in playoff NBA, there's a bigger effort by the coaches to specifically match up against the team they're playing, at least from what I've experienced. And with fewer games on the slate and probably less overall late swap opportunity, I think there's an edge to be gained of spending a little bit of time and looking at how the teams are going to match up against one another. So I guess to Nikhil's point here, this is a good opportunity to answer this question. I don't remember exactly, to be honest, with how often the lineups come out. There's a couple things. I do think the lineups come out a little bit more reliably on time. There's also less surprising news, I would say, in general. But coaches are a little bit incentivized. I don't know. I think it goes both ways. I think there's situations where coaches are a little incentivized to hold off on their lineup changes until close to the game, so they're not like game planned against when, if you're making a move, changing the lineup to play a little bit different strategically, you don't want the other team to match that by knowing what the lineup is too far out in advance. But you're also not going to have a situation where a guy's just getting rested or the teams are going to play their best players to try to win these games. So you don't have situations where some random guy Towns is not getting ruled out for rest tonight, right? That kind of thing isn't going to happen. So I don't know if I would be comfortable personally if I knew I couldn't late swap. Like I had to set my lineups at lock and I wouldn't be able to late swap. I don't think I would play still. I think I'd probably still skip the slate. I think I also wouldn't. I'd feel a little disingenuous telling you that it's okay to play NBA DFS ever, even in the playoffs, if you can't late swap. But I do think the projections are a little bit more reliable. So I guess, kind of those are some of the big takeaways here is that I think, you've got a more condensed rotation, right? But on these teams are going to play their best players more. The further the playoffs go along, I think you'll continue to see these rotations condense. You'll see also a little bit more interesting strategic decisions of those rotations based on what the coach wants to do. These are just single games tonight, right? The playing games, one and done. As the playoffs go along and we get into these 7-game series, you'll see a little bit more of an interesting chess battle between the coaches of the way, it's very likely, for example, that a team that goes down 0-2, is probably going to do something a little bit differently. They may or may not. It depends on what the coach wants to do. It depends on how, the context of those games. But I think it's very, very common that you see kind of things change. And then maybe if the team wins game 3, maybe the other team does something a little bit differently with their rotation in game 4, their matchups or how they match up to other players on the court. I think that's all pretty interesting. And since you're not getting as much of a late swap edge, I think that's kind of interesting it's an interesting thing to dive into and research a little bit more. So let's talk about that all. I'm not an expert in this, and I will pretty openly say that. I think NBA DFS, for me, a lot of times during the regular season, I'm really optimizing for that late swap and really think that late swap's the biggest edge. In playoffs, I'll scale back a little bit just because I know that dialing in and studying the rotations is something that I think is really interesting. I think it's really fun, but it's not as much my overall strength of my NBA DFS strategy. So I'll scale back my investment a little bit here and play a little bit more for fun. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about this, I would check out Max's video if you somehow haven't seen it yet. Because Max does a lot of this editing, studying, even during the regular season, studying rotations, keying into what different teams play like when players are on or off the court. And early this season, right at the start of the season, he recorded his process of doing this for an NBA main slate for like a 10-game slate. It's pretty cool to watch. And I would, even if you've seen it, go back as a refresher and watch this. And he shows some of the tools that he likes to use for studying rotations and usage and things like that. And it's in this video on our YouTube channel. So I'd go check that out. But a couple things that I like to look at here. And again, this is something that, I would probably do rather than right now. Like, don't waste your time really doing this too in depth right now, but maybe an hour before lock is a good time to start looking into this. I like to look at the minutes projections, and I like to see, what kind of rotation are we projecting for a team, and how many minutes are we projecting for the studs? And I think it's pretty fair to think that, the best players on a team in a game that is essentially an elimination game, like these play-in games, are probably going to play 36 minutes. I would think. That doesn't mean everybody in the starting lineup is going to play 36 minutes, but like this is kind of actually encouraging and kind of what I was hoping to see for somebody like Garland, who's going to need to play a lot of minutes for the Cavs to win this game. On the flip side, right, similar deal with Durant and Kyrie, right? These minutes projections look pretty good. One that I think actually, I've got my eye on, that I'm kind of keeping an eye out through the rest of the day here, is Towns, 33-ish minutes, 33 and a half minutes. I think Towns is probably liable to play a few more minutes than this. I think, a 36 minutes projection is probably a little bit more likely. I don't know. I'd probably want to do a little bit of research there and see, how often does Towns get up to 36 minutes at all? Does he ever play 36 minutes, even in the regular season? This is still the first play-in game, and if the Wolves win this game, they've got to go play the rest of the playoffs. So, I don't know how high I'd want to take this, but this does seem a little bit low. And overall, the Wolves rotation seems really big to me the way it's currently projected, right? I mentioned before, I think teams are going to trim down to those 8 or 9 man rotations, at least early in the playoffs. And we have a 10-man rotation at the moment projected, with Prince and Noel playing like 10 minutes-ish, 5 to 10 minutes. It just seems like a little bit of a wide rotation. So that's something I'd be kind of keying into as well. The way I would basically handle this, again, as somebody that's not so much an expert in doing this, is basically just figure out if you've got a team where minutes are a little spread out or the studs look a little under projected. I would probably just consider, kind of bumping everybody a bit here to give an extra boost of where some of these minutes could actually potentially go. I'm not trying to go through and make sure every minute adds up perfectly and figure out who's getting whose minutes. But, if I feel like the starters or the core players for the team might get a little bit more run than we're projecting at these players' expense, I will just do something like this. And you can be, as the playoffs goes on, you can be a little bit more deliberate about this. Right. These are essentially elimination games tonight. So it's a pretty interesting case study. But for true elimination games as the playoffs go on, there may be situations, especially, if Garland is getting 38 minutes a game throughout the playoffs and the Cavs win this game tonight, for example, and then, he's playing 36, 37, 38 minutes, and then suddenly they're down, 3-2 in the next round of the playoffs. He's playing 38 minutes in the regular playoff games. I think you'd probably think the Cavs push him. Maybe, he might have 40 minutes upside in that game. And I think you can make a few adjustments there as well. So all of this say, I think, keep an eye on how we are projecting the rotation. I would say, I think if you have extra time in your process, first of all, I should answer this explicitly. Do the Sims account for condensed player rotations during the NBA playoffs? Yes, we do. There is basically an effort made. We have an understanding that teams are going to play with a tighter rotation and give their stars a little bit more run. So you shouldn't feel like you have to do all of this work by any means. I think a little bit of additional value could be added here by keying into individual teams and seeing how those minutes projections and rotations project. If you have even then a little bit more time as the playoffs go on, I would look into how teams are actually running these rotations on a game-to-game basis, and especially if a team changes something up, looking into that particular game and seeing if that's something that maybe is a trend that is likely to continue, or an outlier kind of game or something like that can be a really big value add, because just knowing who's going to be on the court for these games, I think is super valuable. So, and also, if this is something that you'll be new to and haven't done a lot of this kind of thinking for NBA DFS before, scale a little bit back, right? That's what I do. I'll be watching most of the playoff basketball games anyway. I think this is like one of the best time of year for sports, but I am comfortable saying that, rotational research at NBA is not something that I'm as skilled at as other things in the DFS space. So I scale a little bit back at this time of year and enjoy the games and have a little bit of a sweat going on anyway. So, but good questions, good place to start for us today. I'm super excited for these games. So I'm rooting for the Cavs and the Wolves. I don't like LA teams and I don't like the Nets. So go Cavs, go Wolves. But anyway, cool. Let's keep it going here. And I think we'll probably make a quick little pivot here into some baseball questions here. So quick one. This was from K-Mac. Similar kind of question came in yesterday. And I see some questions in YouTube chat, guys. We'll get to those here shortly. I'm going to hit the questions that came in Slack before the stream first. This was from K-Mac. Similar question to what we answered yesterday. He said, is there a way to set a separate exposure to pitchers and hitters separately? There's not at the moment. It's a pretty common request. I've got a note on my end as something maybe that we can look at implementing in the future. Definitely makes a lot of sense to me why you would want to do this. What I would do for now is really just if you have a global exposure, like if you know what your true max global exposure is, just input that here. Just tell us what that is, even if it's maybe you want 60% max exposure to a pitcher and 30% max to a hitter. Just put 60 here, build your lineups, and that's going to really it'll set that cap for your pitchers, and it'll also get you closer to what you want for your hitters, and then you can go in step 3 and get things fine-tuned where you exactly want them to be. But it's a common request that's come in. So I think we can definitely look at, adding something like a positional max exposure. Doesn't seem like it should be too difficult to implement. So, and then JB Shuck here had a question, that, kind of followed up on something I was talking about yesterday with the fill methods. He said, I wanted to verify I've been doubling down on the quarter and dollar entries, but instead wanted to take your approach and fill 40 different lines. Unique random is the best way for that, correct? Again, there's not really like a correct way here, right? I don't want to give the impression that one fill method is right and the others are wrong. I recommend using the unique fill most of the time. I would generally, like broadly speaking, recommend using the unique fill unless you're already playing like 150 different lineups. If you're playing like 3 different 150 maxes or something like that and a bunch of single entries, you get to the point of like, do you really want to manage 500 different unique lineups? But for 40 lineups, I think you might as well accept the fact that you might have a higher scoring lineup in the lower dollar contest, but get the opportunity to get 40 lineups in play instead of 20. If it was a dime time versus the $4, right? I don't know if I'd want to leave it up to that much chance whether my winning lineup was in the dime time or the $4. But if it's the $1 and the quarter, I'd probably accept that for the opportunity to play 40 unique lines. Again, unique random versus unique rank. One of those is not going to be better than the other from an objective standpoint. I think if you are doing a lot of work to edit your exposures, I would use unique random. Because when you edit your exposures, it's typically, you're not really going to have an even exposure throughout your entire set. So if you have 40 lineups and you capped your pitcher, you capped like a pitcher that you were getting 100% exposure to 50 or something, for example, what you're going to find is that the first half of your lineups are probably going to be a ton of that pitcher. The second half of your lineups are probably going to be none of that pitcher. It won't be very even. In that case, I would use the unique random fill so that every single contest has a more like even exposure curve to what your actual full set of lineups looks like. So the exposure of I guess since you're just playing 2 contests, the exposure of either of your 2 contests is about even and matches what the total exposure to any one player is evenly. If you're not doing that, or if you want to double down on SaberScore instead, then you could use something like the unique rank, right? The unique rank is going to say, you could sort by buy-in, for example, here, and say, unique rank fill my lineups and put the top 20 SaberScore into the most expensive contests, right? That's going to, I don't know what's going on here. Let's see. that's going to allow that your number one SaberScore lineup goes into your highest entry dollar. So they all go into the $1, right? And that might be a better way if you're not doing a lot of exposure editing on step 3 to do it there. So again, I think the fill methods in particular on the app, it's one of those places where there's not really a right answer. It really depends a lot on what you are trying to accomplish. There's also not one that is better. Hey, there's Brad. I'm answering your question right now. So if you just joined, I will. I'll kind of continue going, wrap this one up. But core point here, there's not one fill method that's objectively better. It's going to depend a lot on what you want to do. Typically, a lot of times, if somebody is asking the question, what fill method should I use, I point them in the direction of using a unique fill method and probably the unique random fill method, because I think it is the lowest variance option. It will allow you to realize some of your edge and realize some of your expected value sooner rather than later. The rank fill or the unique rank might be slightly more optimized to maximizing profit, but you're going to have a little bit more of probably bigger swings throughout that than if you had used the unique random fill. So for baseball, there's so many. You can build a viable lineup with virtually any combination of stacks. I for my suite of contests here tonight, right? I'm almost certainly just going to end up building 50 lines and filling uniquely. I would rather play 50 lineups, right? There's so many different possible lineup combinations. I mean, there's lineup combinations even in NBA too, but it just feels like to get the diversity I want for baseball in particular, I like to spread out. So that's what I'd recommend. But all right. Cool. Okay. I wanted to hit this question. I think this one, Matt sent me over to this, and this was via a Mike. This was a DM from Matt via Mike about a baseball process here overall. He said, I was curious when you have time if you'd entertain my question or thoughts on my MLB process. So I play a variety of contests, small field single entry, and then a 20 max and a 150 max. For the single entry, I'll only focus on the chalkier teams. Then for the 20 max and the 150 max, I will limit the chalk stacks almost altogether and play the other teams. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something you would think to do? Aside from that, my process for doing that, for the single entry, I would usually just deselect the teams I don't want, so I get those chalkier teams. For the larger field stuff, I'll run SaberSim in step 3 and then adjust my exposure percentages to limit the chalk teams. Is that a good way of doing it? Or in step 1, should I be increasing the team totals for the lower owned team and then run my build so I can try to get more of those teams that way? So I mean, interesting ideas here. Overall, I think the process or the theory behind the process, it sounds pretty good. I think that is in line with how I would recommend, approaching these contests in general. It's in line with what our sliders imply about these contests as well. I think one of the things that can be pretty cool about the sliders in general is you can kind of gut check some of these ideas, right? If we take a small field single entry, 500 person, and look at the sliders, high correlation, lower variance, lower ownership fade, compare that to large field 150 max, right? That backs us up, right? We're valuing variance. We want to be more broadly exposed. We want to have lower exposures and on less chalky teams in our 150 maxes than our single entry. So I think your approach here, I think that's all a very strong approach. I would say process wise, I don't think you're doing anything wrong by any means. And I think in particular, editing your exposure to your comfortable level of risk tolerance in step 3 is a great idea. I think most likely that you may not need to be doing as much as you are doing in step 1 and step 2 ahead of the build to get the same result here, especially going through the trouble of selecting or deselecting what teams you want. I think, let's say, and it sounds like I think that's something that you're doing specifically for the, so really for the, for both contests, right? For both your single entry and your larger field stuff, you will probably get a pool of lineups in step 3 that is already diverse enough without having to go in and put the effort in to limit what teams are in your player pool in step 1. That's kind of the biggest thing I took away from this message here. I would recommend for most of the time for baseball to not really worry about doing any kind of player pool curation or things like that. The projections of different teams are generally kind of close enough, and your sim variance and the variance of the sims themselves is going to be diverse enough that you probably just don't need to do that. And I'll kind of give you an example of what I mean here. We can go in and let's say we're building for a single entry, and let's say it's something like 1,500 lineups or something like that, and build a couple lineups. And see what this looks like. There'll probably be naturally quite a bit of diversity in this pool, and you can probably arrive at a lineup that has the right combinations of stacks that you were trying to get to anyway. It just seems like it's probably a little bit tedious to go through and pick the individual stacks you want in step 1 just to build the lineups that have them here in step 3. So we'll let this build here, and I'll kind of show you what I mean. Overall, I think the way you're approaching this, I think the theory behind your process here makes a lot of sense. Spreading out more in the large field stuff, playing less chalky in the larger field stuff. I think this will just be maybe a little bit of a process time saver for you more than anything. But what I wanted to kind of show here is, so again, this is a single entry. This is like, maybe for like a 1,500 person contest. And I just wanted to look at this pool, right? And see what our team stacks look like for this particular build. So you can see, right? So this is a 9-game slate. So there's 18 teams on it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So obviously only a single lineup in 500 with a twin stack in it. But again, for a single entry, you probably want to play the better teams, the better projected teams overall. My point I'm trying to make is that really without editing your player pool at all, you can build 500 lineups and have every single team stacked in here. So, if you had gone in and maybe you had determined, let's just look, what is the chalk going to look like here? Maybe you had decided that for your single entry bullet that you wanted to stack Braves and Brewers, right? You can probably, go in here and see our Brewer stacks. Okay, so we don't have any Brewers and Braves combined, but you could go in here and kind of take advantage of the filters and go in and find your individual lineups that you end up wanting to play. And this might also point you in a direction of maybe something you weren't looking at, right? Like, I do think it is kind of interesting, if you were to look at Vegas and just look at the chalkiest teams and maybe look at ownership projections and kind of decide on what to play that way, you might have missed overall that SaberSim, at least at the moment, thinks the overall best team to stack in your single entries for a contest of this size appears to be the Rockies. And maybe going in the direction of playing some Rocky stacks is the right overall approach. So let's actually turn this filter off here. You might have missed that, 46.6% of our stacks with the Rocky, or 46.6% of our lineups in our pool for this single entry build are Rocky stacks. And you might have missed that was, an opportunity here to go that way. But overall, Mike, I think you've got the right overall approach. I think the takeaway here is you could probably save some time doing a little bit less work to limit your player pool up front and leaning a little bit more on step 3 to fine tune and pick that final single entry lineup. And this applies for your larger field stuff too. I know there was a comment in here that you're limiting chalk stacks ahead of time and maybe even removing those from your pool. If you want to avoid them completely and it's not too much trouble for you to remove them, great, do it. But I think you could probably just leave them in there and do a little bit more of this work on step 3 and save yourself a little bit of process time. But I think your approach sounds sound to me. So cool. Okay, so another question here, pivoting back over to Stanley here on the NBA side of things. He said, to that point, are the Sims factoring in these matchup requirements or pre-adjustments, or is it more of a manual update on the back end? This is kind of where it gets tricky. But I would say in general, we are not going to make any manual adjustments be above and beyond what the Sims project for the teams. So we have an understanding, we're projecting minutes and we are implying a rotation in there. But like, if there is, it requires a little bit of, I would say, kind of research and intuition, where we are not factoring in matchup requirements in a manual way on our own. So I think it is a good opportunity to key into and see if the way that a team's minutes are projected here matches up with the requirements, the matchup requirements that team will have. And look at, Zubac's projection kind of his minutes projection continues to go up as more Sims run. So I think I was directionally correct with that idea. I would say in general, I think that's a good opportunity to just add some value. I would not worry so much about double counting on that. Like if you're looking at a situation like this where I think it's particularly helpful with bigs, right? The Clippers need somebody to play defense and they need a big to match up against Towns. They need size. The entire Wolves lineup is pretty much enormous, even when Towns is on the bench, right? Some of these other guys that come in are also bigs. They need that in there. So I think that's a good value add to do a little bit of research and look into the minutes projection and see if that kind of adds up. In the regular season, they might just play small, right? They might just say, we're going to play a little bit smaller. We're going to stick to our rotation, at least to see if it works. I think there's maybe an argument to play. They might be a little bit bigger, but when they need to win this game, might do something a little bit different. If this was this is where it gets really interesting, is if this is a 7-game series, maybe they give Zubac and Hartenstein more minutes to match up against Towns and they get smoked in the first 2 games. That might be where they make a pivot, right? And just say, we're going to try to play small. We're going to try to basically play faster than the Wolves can play and understand we have a mismatch down low. And that's where it does get a little bit fun of trying to figure out when teams are going to do that and trying to figure out exactly how teams are going to change in those kinds of situations. But cool. All right, swinging back over to the baseball side of things. It's a fun time of year. We get a little bit of mix of different sports. So Brad had said, Jordan, obviously putting in 40 lines over doubling down on 20 increases your chances. Would you say that it is more profitable with that approach? No. You're the maximizing EV, right? Maximizing your expected value approach would be to play probably all 20 into the same contests. You are going to have more dramatic swings in your results, but you are playing theoretically maybe slightly lower EV lineups in an effort to spread out your risk into that second 20 max contest when you're playing uniquely. The maximizing expected value approach would be to play the same 20 in both lineups, but you are increasing your variance and probably going to increase the swings that you're going to experience by doing that. But mathematically speaking, assuming that SaberScore is a good tool, right? Is a valuable measurement of or an approximation of expected value. The maximizing EV approach would be to play the same 20 in both contests. I think that does reach a point where it's not, you could follow that to its logical conclusion and just say, well, why don't I just play one lineup and everything? And obviously that would be, extremely risky, right? You'd be very exposed to risk at that point. Because you're all in on one lineup every single night. So there's a balance there, right? And I think on the baseball side of things, I prefer to be more on the side of spreading out risk, right, than on the maximizing EV. So there's also a side of this of like, if you are actively trying to grow your bankroll, it makes sense to earn back equity as quickly as possible, even if you haven't maximized that, because you are reinvesting that into your DFS process, right? Like, you could have $500 at the end of the season or $100 tomorrow, right? Well, if that $100 is going back into the DFS bankroll and being reinvested, that gives you more opportunity to play more volume the next night and compound that, provided you're a profitable player, right? So there's an advantage, actually. I guess it is not entirely clear necessarily how much. It is not entirely clear, depending on how much of that you're reinvesting into your bankroll, that using the same 20 lineups in both is always the more profitable option. So, but anyway, I feel like I'm kind of rambling here a little bit on this particular point. That I would like, if you were just basically saying like best practices, tell me what to do. I would really recommend, if you're just playing 220 maxes every night, just play 40 unique lineups for baseball in particular. I think you are going to be happier with the results of that. You're going to have more opportunities to win more quickly. And if you are planning on reinvesting that and growing a bankroll, and I think it makes a lot more sense to just accept potentially not being maximized for expected value or being perfectly optimized for expected value, and instead playing a lower variance strategy. So in NBA, I am more comfortable potentially playing a more of a double down type approach. A lot of times for me in particular, until I get to 150 unique lineups, I will play a unique lineup and everything until I get to 150. But in NBA, I'd be a little bit more comfortable using the rank fill and doubling down on your top 20 overall, just because players' ranges of outcomes are more centered around their mean. Right. If you look at a guy, maybe you're over the field on Paul George, right? His projection is 46.7. Well, most of his outcomes are around 46.7. So what is he most likely to do on the NBA slate, right? I mean, you can kind of just eyeball this and see 12%, that's 25, that's 39, and that's 51. So about 50% of the time, Paul George scores roughly in between 40 and 52 points with an average projection of 46.7. Right? If you have 100% exposure to him or something like that in 20, you can probably feel better about that than you would looking at a baseball hitter's range of outcomes, who you may be 100% exposed to, right? So let's pull one up just to demo this here, right? Let's grab one of these guys, right? You're 100% exposed to Juan Soto, whose average projection is 10.93. Actually, this is actually a pretty friendly curve for a hitter. They don't typically look like that. Here's maybe a better one. Tyler O'Neill, right? Most common 20% of the time doesn't score at all, right? So yeah. Saw this question here. I wanted to hit this from Steven. Do I need to look at SaberScore on MLB? I typically recommend for virtually all sports to allow SaberScore to be your tiebreaker of what lineups you are going to play after you have added value to whatever other steps of the process you want to. So if you don't want to make any other adjustments and you want to come in here and just select your build settings, build your lineups, proceed to step 3, right? I think SaberScore will do a very good job. Maybe you've built this build here and you want to play 3 lineups. I think SaberScore will do a very good job of identifying what the best 3 lineups of your pool are to play without any other adjustments to exposure or anything like that. I don't think you need to blindly play based on SaberScore. So if you look at this and maybe you come over here and say, wow, in 3 lineups, can't say I'm overly excited about playing a Orioles stack on a 9-game slate. That's perfectly fine. I wouldn't feel like you have to play this Orioles stack just because it's the number 1 SaberScore lineup in your pool. There's probably another lineup that's, relatively close in expected value here that we can play instead. So we'll zero out the Baltimore stacks here. Man, I really need to get a new computer too. I am like maxing. I can hear my CPU just like churning to handle me streaming and doing this at the same time. But then we could do that, right? And then maybe we come over here and we say, wow, I don't know if I really want to play like this aggressively with my exposures. So let's go ahead and adjust Atlanta stacks down and maybe get some more diversity here. And we'll give this a second to update. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, yes, I think SaberScore is valuable. I think it can be useful. I wouldn't feel like you need to be all in on SaberScore. So okay, cool. Let me catch up on some of these other questions that have come in here. So Neil said, Jordan, just catching up on the video, so I'm a little behind. I don't know if I agree that the MLB Minimaxes contests are that sharp. I'm probably a little overconfident after taking second in the $1. But there's a ton of really bad lineups. The winner played a 4-stack with 4 one-offs. A couple things on that. First of all, I would probably feel pretty sharp taking second in it too. Congratulations, by the way. Easy to feel like a contest plays soft the day after you almost take it down. I also don't know if I'd necessarily just write off a 4-stack with 4 one-offs as just being objectively a bad lineup, especially in the mini-max, right? There's a huge, yesterday I think it was 60,000 entries, right? I mean, if you had gone in here and built with these settings, 150 max and over 50K entrance, I would imagine you would probably see I would not be surprised to see a naked 4-stack in your pool here. I don't think that necessarily means it's a bad lineup. The one thing that is a fact here, and this is just you can calculate this for yourself. You can vet this. There are over 50% of the lineups in that contest on most nights are made by people 150 maxing. That does not mean all those players are sharp. Sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes it's 60%. The 50 cent mini max is even worse. There's like sometimes 70% of those lineups are made by 150 maxers. And that does not mean that those players are sharp. Not everybody playing 150 lineups is necessarily sharp. But if they're building 150 lineups, they're probably coming at it, they have some kind of process, right? They're probably using some kind of tools. They're probably spending some level of time on this. When you start talking about a 16% rake, those are not really the people that you're targeting to make your money off of, to be completely honest, right? That's not really, the biggest advantage there. So I don't want to come across like I'm saying the minimax is not beatable. But I do feel pretty confident in saying that it is a misleadingly sharp contest. It plays far sharper than people expect it to, based on the stakes it is at, because of how much equity is occupied in that contest by relatively sharp players that have some sense of what they are trying to accomplish. I would be surprised to see somebody with a 150 lineup set, for example, approaching that with no eye towards ownership or no eye towards correlation or things like that. And that's part of where the edge goes, right? I think like in some ways, when you are playing, there's going to be a greater percent of lineups in the $5 single entry, for example, that were made without a thought towards correlation or ownership or anything really. Projections, right? That is less so amongst people that are 150 maxing. So again, I believe it's beatable. I play the mini max pretty frequently. I just think it's sharp, and I think it's sharper than almost every other contest under $3. So, but also, congrats, man. That's awesome. And that's a hell of a way to start the season too. That always feels good right at the start. You feel like you kind of get that out of the way, and have some house money to kind of work with from there. Feels good. So, James says, is a 4-man Yankee stack 1 through 4, then coming back with a 3-man Texas stack a bad idea today? I don't have any idea, to be honest. What I would do is I would say I would go and build some lineups that are optimized for the contest that you are trying to build for, and see how likely that these teams are showing up, right? So, first of all, it sounds like you're playing a single lineup here. So I'm going to assume it's a single entry, but maybe it's not. Maybe this is for a 150 max or something like that. The optimal strategy of how you want to approach the slate is going to change quite a bit based on what contest you're playing. So I'd go in and build some lineups and maybe go see what's popping. We have the Yankees and the Rangers both projected fairly well today. So I think a Yankee stack with, well, maybe this is a FanDuel build, 4-4-3. Maybe this is FanDuel, but we'll do it on DraftKings for now. I imagine that it's probably pretty easy to stack the Yankees and Texas together. I think that probably makes a lot of sense for a single entry. But we can fortunately build this pool of lineups and see what we're getting out of it. I probably wouldn't worry so much about stacking the Yankees 1 through 4 in general. In my stacks, I'm generally pretty unconcerned with the batting order. I think batting order is overrated in terms of the way it affects correlation. The main correlations you get for baseball are between all the batters in the order, right? And it is because every time somebody gets on base or fails to get out, everybody gets that much closer to the next plate appearance. The concurrent scoring opportunities where, 1 through 3 get on base and 4 cleans up, right? That actually doesn't represent the majority of why batters are correlated with one another in the first place. It is batting order, I think, is overrated when it comes to stacks. But let's look at this here and let's see. I'm curious how many lineups in our pool have these combinations of players here. Let's take a look. Give this a second here. Man, it might be upgrade season, to be honest. I wish you guys could hear my CPU. Actually, no, I don't. Don't wish you could. But it might be upgrade season for me. Okay, so we can see the lineups here. Let's go ahead and filter and see, are we getting any Yankees and Texas stacks? Yankees, Texas. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, this is the only way to play. But I don't know. 500 lineups optimized for a single entry, only one lineup that stacks the Yankees and Rangers together. I definitely don't think it's not suboptimal, right, by any means. But personally, if you're asking for my personal take, if I was playing a single bullet, I'd probably go a different direction just because, we only have one kind of random lineup between these two teams that pops together here. And it just doesn't seem like a very popular, it doesn't really seem like a direction that SaberSim really wants to go at the moment. I also think, I think it's probably going to be somewhat chalky. Like the fact combined that the Rangers are the highest implied team total on the slate, the Yankees are 6th. The Yankees are also popular. People love stacking the Yankees. And coupled with that, SaberSim doesn't really want to play those two teams together. I'd probably avoid it. But again, that doesn't mean it's a bad construction. You can kind of do whatever you want in baseball, to be completely honest. If especially with a single lineup, you could pick teams kind of out of a hat almost, and stack them together and probably have a decent construction of those two teams. Let's see. All right, catching up. I see some conversation here going on in Slack here. HC said, Jordan, any advice when using SaberSim on the standard plan, build 20 lineups, using the default 500, but it restricted me in using the lineup I liked sorting through. Should I just run 20 instead? I do single entry. Any advice when using the SaberSim standard plan? I built. That's strange. It shouldn't. So I guess I think I get what's happening here. So since you don't have access to view the full pool, you can't go in and handpick those lineups out. What I would probably recommend doing here is I would lean a little bit more heavily on your exposures rather than trying to handpick lineups. I would work with the exposures a little more, and that should allow you to kind of work within the requirements of the starter plan. So, rather than diving into the pool, right? Edit these exposures. So, if you want Here's a good example, right? Let's go back. Maybe you want some more Houston stacks, right? Bump up your minimum exposures to Houston stacks and work that direction instead of trying to handpick the lineups. I would recommend sticking more on the side of playing 20 lineups instead of just playing only a single bullet, especially in baseball. More opportunities to realize some of your equity there by playing more lineups than less. But yeah. Matt says, any chance a view/filter of your stack combos is coming, the teams and the stack type they are in? So you can you can kind of do this a little. You can do this obviously a little bit now, right? You can go in here and see your individual stack combinations here of different teams. You can filter also and look at, for example, your Dodgers stacks. And then this will show you what are your exposures along with your other Dodger stacks. What is not here at the moment and what is most likely coming is a way to then interact directly with this, right? And say, I don't want to cap my Colorado exposure overall, but I want to cap my Colorado exposure within Dodger stacks. You can't do that at the moment. That is something that is on our radar. It's a very, very uniquely baseball request. So I think we have plans to add that in the future, but I don't have an ETA on when we can expect that at the moment. So looks like Demetrius is looking for some NHL settings. Demetrius, I would start here with this video, how to beat NHL DFS in 2021. I had two of our NHL experts from our community here come on and join me for a stream now 5 months ago at the start of hockey season and walk through their processes for using SaberSim with NHL. I'd go and give this video a watch. There's a lot of great information in there. If you're looking for something shorter, this one's older. This is a 2-year-old video, but if you need something shorter, 20 minutes long here is a good kind of bite-sized starter video for NHL. So. Cool. Steven said, how can I find team stacks where I can find leverage? Yeah, good question. So one of the things that I like to do, I have a few different ways of doing this, but I think the simplest way is I like to look here and I'll run builds that are, I want to reset all of my exposures here. Oh man, starting to get kind of frustrated with my computer being slow here. I apologize for everybody watching here that I'm kind of dragging along here, but what I like to do is I will, a lot of this depends on the contest you're playing, right? The amount of leverage you need over the field on certain players and stacks varies differently based on different contests, right? In this was a single entry for 1,500 people. You're not going to need to fade as much ownership. You're not going to need to get as different from the field in a contest like this as you do to do what Neil did last night and virtually take down the minimax, right? But in general, I like to run test builds and research builds to see, what are the teams that are popping up most commonly here compared to what are going to be the chalkiest teams. And to determine what the chalkiest teams are going to be, I like to look at the ownership projections, right? And I like to look at the Vegas totals. And you can actually kind of see, right? These are in agreement here. It seems like the chalkiest overall team, according to both SaberSim and to Vegas, is going to be Texas. And SaberSim is just fading Texas completely here in the first 20 lineups it would make for this single entry contest, right? And it's instead pointing you in the direction of the Dodgers, which I don't know if I like. That's a weather game, bit weather concern there. But Colorado is an interesting stack, right? That SaberSim is already kind of giving you leverage in that way, right? It's already kind of making a decision actually that, we can fade the chalky Rangers stacks and play Colorado and then kind of virtually do whatever you want from there. You'll get a different answer to this question of where your leverage can be found if you're building for a larger field contest, right? You may have to fade a little bit more aggressively. But as a starting point, right, where can you get leverage? Run builds. I think another build you can experiment with, I would start with running default settings builds for the contest you're playing, but another build you can experiment with is running a build on 0-0-10 settings. and this will basically build the optimal for the slate for 500 different simulations or whatever. That's the impact of this. I think you can run this kind of build and see what teams, what names, what batters are popping up most commonly, right? And this will give you an ownership unadjusted view of the slate, and then compare that to your Vegas totals or your ownership projections and see, what are maybe the teams that are sneaky? What are the teams that are going under owned? So there you go. But Neil said, Jordan, is the reason you prefer the $4 max over the mini max due to effective entrance? Maybe I need to realign my thinking. I was thinking that the $4 contest would be sharper. Yes. And I feel pretty confident that $4 is a better place to play. I don't want to come across like that is the de facto 100% better option. But there are, even adjusting for the fact that the mini max is under $3, I think it is still more efficient to spend your money in the $4 max first. Personally, I think that contest is going to play a lot sharper. I think there is a decent argument to be made that because you get the opportunity to play, even if it's the $1 mini max, you can play 80 lineups compared to 20 for the same amount of money in the mini max. I think there's a good argument to be made that allows you to spread out your variance a lot more. But with that said, I don't know if that balances out the difference in what I feel like your expected ROI is between these two contests. I definitely prefer the $4 max at the moment. I think it's going to play softer. So Neil said someone start a GoFundMe for Jordan's new computer. Yeah, maybe. Let's see. I'm gonna, just for fun, we got a second here. I'm pulling up the task manager and seeing. Yeah, so we're at 100% CPU usage, guys, which just isn't going to cut it. So no GoFundMe needed. But I think we're going to need a replacement here pretty quick. Because I'm not really doing too much with this thing. I've got the stream going and I've got SaberSim going, and we're maxing out here. So not great. Brad said, MLB, say I have a player and I increase his exposure from 2 lines to 10. I already removed all 2 stacks. Will these 8 lines I added in continue to change so it still meets my stack requirements? Yeah, so we'll kind of continue to keep track of everything as we move along. So if you go in here and say, I don't want to play 4-2-2s, right? And you make this adjustment and then you go back and bump up your stack exposure to some random team, it will continue to honor the exposures that have already been set here. So it won't fill in your team stacks with 4-2-2s of the team that you're trying to fill in. So it will continue to kind of keep track of that throughout what's it called? As you're adjusting exposures. So Anthony said, I got a question. In NBA Showdown / FanDuel with a high number of lineups, I don't get any of the lowest owned guys. Should I really fade them or force them in? I personally don't like leaving out some players, and I'm kind of surprised it left anyone out with that many lineups in 1,500. It's an interesting question here. It's hard for me to say specifically. I'll say this. So, if we pull up let's pull up, actually the featured game is this one, right? The bigger contests are for this one. So as long as you're building, as long as your sim variant slider is set at 10 here, when you go in to actually build these lineups, every lineup is represented by a single simulation. Oh, so Anthony says he was looking at Nets Cleveland. It should be the same deal here. I don't think it matters very much, right? Every lineup you're getting here is represented by a single sim. So, what that means is that these are 500 individual simulations here. So if we look at projections, right? So, the only player we didn't get in this game in 500 is Taurean Prince. I think there's an argument. I think you could say does Taurean Prince really have less than a 1 in 500 chance to be in the optimal lineup? I don't know, but he doesn't show up in 500 different simulations of this game, right? And every other player is showing up. We can come over here. Let's do Cleveland and Brooklyn here and just see what we're getting out. I think probably from a practical standpoint, if you disagree, the best course of action for you would be to go back to step one and bump that player's projection up. But personally, for me, I would feel pretty confident in fading a player completely if there was not a single lineup in 500. So if for me, for example, here in my full pool of 500, I'm getting exposure to every single player that is projected, at least in the utility spot. So, I mean, with that said, you're not going to get exposure to every player in 20. That's just not enough lineups to cover like that many different outcomes. But I would say you're probably going to get exposure to every player in a big pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups with sim variance 10. Anthony says, I guess I'm trying to tell the difference of when the sim needs a little push, you can call it. For me, I would probably assume, I would in general assume that if the builder says that a player is not optimal in a single simulation for 1,500 lineups, that it's probably a good fade. I would not necessarily talk you out of increasing that player's projection and running it again to get more exposure to that player. But with that much of sample size, 1,500 simulations, that player's not showing up in a single lineup, I would probably just avoid that player. But that's kind of my strategy when it comes to DFS, is I am generally relatively trusting of the projections. Like, I am pretty confident in what the projections say. I generally assume that the projections and the simulations are taking into account what is important. And I find my edge through other means, right? In single game NBA, for example, I am mostly more interested in coming up with unique lineups and figuring out a way to differentiate. I'm more interested in looking at a way to differentiate against the field and play unique lineups as opposed to improve upon the projections. So, okay. And then Anthony said, I'm surmising the best way to use SaberSim would be to make 1,500 lineups and pick 150, because when I look at the way you do it, you guys put a lot of time into it. That is basically exactly what I would recommend you do. Is build a big pool of lineups and go from there. So, okay. Let me get caught up here and let me back up and then get kind of caught up here, and make sure I got all the questions here. There was a good one. I did want to touch on this. All right. Steven had asked, should I use SaberScore or projected score? Definitely use SaberScore for sorting your lineups in step 3 for baseball. SaberScore is going to take into account correlation, most importantly, which is just a huge factor. If you sort by projected score, you'll get a lot less stacked, a lot less correlated lineups. I would essentially never sort by projected score for baseball. So, cool. Let's see. Edward asks a question here. And says, hey, reacting to your comment on Colorado having the heaviest stacks, I'm using a part of your process from last year comparing the lines from your SaberSim build, the Fantasy Lab Vegas lines, and another provider's lines. Today, the Vegas has Colorado at 4.6 projected runs. The other provider has Colorado at 4.35, and SaberSim has Colorado at 5.7. Doing today's homework and notice this difference. Yeah, I think that's sharp. I think that's a good observation. I don't necessarily know exactly why we have Colorado projected so high. I think that's an interesting opportunity to maybe consider dropping them down. It's possible also that Vegas is missing something about this game. But I do think we are pretty high on Colorado. I was looking for them here. 4.6, like almost a full run difference. I think it's an interesting idea to drop them down and at least to see what exposure looks like there. and going from there. Definitely a full run discrepancy between Vegas and SaberSim to me often is a little bit of a flag of, something's funny's going on here. Or not even funny, not necessarily wrong. I don't want to give the impression that I think it's necessarily wrong, but it could be that we are more bearish on Martin Perez, who's honestly not my favorite pitcher. It's also possible that we think that the Colorado lineup as a whole is just a better batting team. But I do agree that it's worth maybe at least looking into when you go to build your lineups. And it's possible that will also kind of just resolve itself out anyway in future sims. So but cool. Okay, I think that will be our last question here for today. So I appreciate everybody tuning in, asking questions. To those of you that watch and listen to the show after it goes up on YouTube, appreciate you as well. Enjoy the double slate of baseball today and the play-in games for the NBA slate. Looking forward to it. Fun day of DFS. We will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern for another stream. So good luck tonight, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.